In 1983, when long-sealed plantation records from the Savannah River Valley were finally opened, a team of archivists stumbled on something that didn't fit anywhere in the tidy story. Georgia liked to tell about its antebellum past. On the Hartwell, a state inventory, buried between lists of livestock and bales of cotton, there was a curious entry, cabin, West Row, occupied by Mulatto Rose, fittings unusual. The file that went with it held sketches and notes from an 1851 inspection. A slave cabin with hand-carved moldings, a brick fireplace with decorative ironwork, glass windows with curtains, and a locked trunk containing items no enslaved person should have owned. The state archivists expected records of cruelty. They did not expect evidence of a single enslaved woman living in a space that looked, on paper, almost privileged. What they found in that cabin's description raised questions. The local authorities would dodge for decades, because according to the notes, what had happened inside that room in 1851 hinted at a conspiracy reaching into the highest circles of Georgia society, a web of lies so dangerous that 5 men would die to keep it hidden, and the Hartwell descendants would later pay to have the records buried again. But the story doesn't begin in an archive. It begins on a humid spring morning in Burke County, Georgia, when everything still appeared perfectly ordinary. In 1851, the Hartwell Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of rich, dark soil along the Savannah River, about 20 miles southwest of Augusta. It was one of the most prosperous estates in the county, its wealth built on cotton, tobacco, rice, and the forced labor of 143 enslaved people. The main house rose on a slight rise, a 2-story Greek Revival structure with white columns that caught the morning light. Magnolia trees lined the drive, their thick, waxy blossoms perfuming the air each spring. From the front porch, the whole place could be mistaken for a painting of Southern gentility. From behind the house, the truth was easier to see. Too long. Rows of slave cabins stood beyond the main yard, each single-room structure crammed with 6 to 10 people. Dirt floors turned to mud when it rained. Gaps between warped planks let in wind and cold. Smoky. Shared fireplaces were made of mud and sticks. Families received weekly rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses, and worked from first light until after dusk and planting and harvest seasons. On Sundays, Thomas Hartwell allowed them the afternoon for themselves. He considered this proof of his generosity. Thomas had inherited the plantation from his father in 1843. At 38, his neighbors called him a progressive planter. What they meant was that he preferred manipulation and strict routines to constant whipping, though he did not hesitate to use violence when he thought it necessary. He kept meticulous ledgers, attended church every Sunday, and sat on the county agricultural board. His wife, Catherine, brought Charleston polish to the place, fine manners, fine china, and fine connections. They had 2 children, 14-year-old Richard, already being groomed to manage the estate, and 11-year-old Anne, whose days revolved around needlework, French lessons, and piano practice. From a distance, the Hartwell family fit neatly into the picture of respectable Southern life. It was the cabins that told a different story. One in particular, the enslaved people's quarters formed 2 straight lines behind the house. But one cabin broke the pattern. It sat slightly apart at the end of the western row, separated by a small strip of open ground just enough distance to feel wrong. At first glance, the cabin looked like all the others. Rough wooden walls, a pitched roof, a single door. But anyone who cared to really look could see the differences. The wood was newer. The roof didn't sag. The door hung straight and true on its hinges. A narrow vegetable garden grew beside it, neatly tended, something no other cabin possessed. But the most unsettling difference wasn't what was there. It was what S and single quotes T. No children darted in and out of that door. No cooking smoke curled from its chimney at dusk. There was no spill of conversation, no bursts of laughter or songs. Only one person lived there. Her name was Rose. Rose arrived at Hartwell Plantation in the summer of 1848, purchased at an estate sale in Augusta. The seller's ledger described her in cold handwriting, mulatto female, approximately 18 years, housed, exceptional appearance, no visible scars. Thomas Hartwell had paid $850 for her, nearly 3 times the usual price for a female field hand. Catherine had not accompanied him to the sale. When the wagon carrying Rose rolled into the yard, people noticed. Her skin was the color of honey in strong light. Her features were delicate, her dark hair long and curling when not tied back. She moved with a measured grace that felt practiced, as if she had been taught to glide through rooms where every misstep might be punished, and she could read. That secret didn't stay secret long. Within days of her arrival, a house slave saw her standing in the main house pantry, calmly reading the labels on medicine bottles. Her speech carried no obvious Southern accent. To those who listened closely, her voice hinted at time spent among white families. Perhaps even in northern city. At first, Thomas assigned her to the main house to help with sewing and light cleaning. She worked quietly, obediently, drifting at the edges of Catherine's daily routine. But within 2 weeks, Thomas announced a change. Rose would live alone in a cabin. She would perform special duties for the family. He did not explain what those duties were. After that, things around Rose began to shift in ways that did not match the brutal logic of slavery. She no longer appeared regularly in the main house. Yet she was not sent to the fields either. Her clothes were finer than any other enslaved woman's fabric that looked chosen, not handed out from a barrel. Her weekly rations included things others almost never saw: white flour, fresh butter, coffee beans, white sugar. It didn't take long for whispers to begin. Some women said they saw Thomas slipping toward Rose's cabin after dark. Others claimed Catherine's face went hard whenever Rose's name was mentioned. The overseer, a German immigrant named Klaus Fischer, never went near the cabin. He had clearly been told not to when a field hand made a crude comment about Rose. Within Fischer's hearing, the punishment was swift. The man was given 15 lashes and sold to a plantation in South Carolina before the week was out. Rose's isolation would have broken many people. She lived alone in that too-quiet cabin, cut off from the fragile community that formed among the other enslaved families. She attended no gatherings. She joined no whispered prayers over cooking fires. She did not share in the small daily acts of resistance, stolen moments of laughter, slow work, quietly sabotaged tools that helped others feel a sliver of control to them. She became something almost unreal. A beautiful mystery who drifted between her cabin and some secret arrangement with the master. But behind her calm, Rose was watching. She had long ago learned how to move through white spaces without attracting attention, a survival skill honed in households where simply being noticed could be dangerous. On Hartwell Plantation, she watched and listened and stored everything away. She observed the rhythms of the estate when Fisher made his rounds, when Thomas met with neighboring planters, when Catherine took her afternoon rest, when the house. Slaves gathered in the kitchen to gossip. She noted who held real power and who only pretended. Who could be trusted with a secret and who would trade anything for favor. Slowly, she built an invisible map of the plantation's true architecture, not the buildings, but the network of fear and control that kept everything running. At night, she lit the small oil lamp Thomas had provided and wrote in a journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The journal was a dangerous object. Writing itself was an act of rebellion. But Rose had learned something important in her years of bondage. The most effective weapons often looked harmless, right? Up until the moment they were used. On the morning of April 3rd, 1851, something unusual happened. Catherine Hartwell did not come down to breakfast. At first, Thomas assumed she was tired. Spring planting brought late nights and early mornings. When the servants had finished setting the table and the food was cooling on its platters, he frowned and sent an older house slave, Dina, to check on his wife. Dina knocked on the bedroom door. No answer. She stepped inside and found Catherine, lying rigidly on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her chest rose and fell. She was breathing, but She did not blink, did not turn her head when Dina called her named out by mid-morning. The doctor had been fetched from Augusta. Dr. Samuel Winthrop had tended the Hartwell family for 15 years. He examined Catherine in private while Thomas paced the hallway outside, hands locked behind his back. After half an hour, the doctor emerged wearing the expression of solemn confidence men like Thomas paid for, a nervous condition. He pronounced, brought on by strain and perhaps an unbalanced diet. She needs rest, reduced stimulation, and a tonic I'll prepare. Thomas accepted this without question. In 1851, Georgia, white women's suffering was often renamed nerves bundled into a story about fragile constitutions and delicate minds. It was easier than looking for real causes, but that evening, after the doctor left and the house settled into a tense quiet, Thomas did something he had never done before. He sent for Rose. She entered the main house just after sunset through the back door, as instructed. Thomas waited for her in his study, surrounded by shelves of books he seldom opened and agricultural journals he read carefully. He closed the door behind her. Mrs. Hartwell is unwell, he said, his tone carefully neutral. She requires care beyond what Dina can provide. You have a gentle manner and a steady hand. You will attend her during her recovery. Rose kept her gaze lowered, as expected. Yes. Sir, you understand this is a position of trust. His voice sharpened slightly. You will sleep in the small room next to her chamber. You will see to her needs, administer her medicine, and report any change directly to me. You will speak of this arrangement to no one. I understand, sir. He studied her for a long moment. Something flickered across his face worry. Calculation, both. Catherine has been under strain, he added slowly. She's been saying things that are not rational. If she tells you anything that seems confused or fanciful, you are not to repeat it. Do you understand? Yes, sir. He dismissed her with a wave. The small room Thomas had assigned her was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a window and a door that shut. Compared to her cabin, it felt almost extravagant. Catherine lay in the adjoining bedroom. Blonde hair spread across the pillow, hands folded on the coverlet. Her eyes were open but unfocused, like someone who had fallen into a deep pool and never quite surfaced. Mrs. Hartwell, Rose said softly, I am here to care for you. For a moment, there was nothing. Then Catherine's eyes slowly sharpened and found Rose's face. When she spoke, her voice was a thin whisper, but the words made Rose's blood go cold. He killed her. Catherine murmured, You look just like her. He killed my sister, and now he has brought you here to remind me. Rose's posture did not change. Her expression stayed smooth the way she had trained it to. But inside, her mind spun. She had never heard a single mention of Catherine having a sister. The Hartwell family story, as the enslaved community understood it, contained no tragic drowning, no lost fiancé, no dead woman at all. You should rest, ma'am, Rose said gently, lifting a damp cloth to Catherine's forehead. The doctor said you must rest. Catherine's hand shot out, gripping Rose's wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes were suddenly clear, painfully aware. You don't understand, she hissed. He will do the same to you. He can't help himself. I have tried to warn others, but they put me in this bed and call me hysterical. You must leave this house. You must run while you still can. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Catherine's grip released. Her face emptied, slipping back into that blank stare as the door opened and Thomas stepped inside, carrying a glass of dark liquid. Her medicine, he said, handing it to Rose. See that she drinks all of it. The bitter smell of laudanum rose from the glass. Catherine swallowed obediently. Within minutes, her eyelids drooped and her breathing slowed. Thomas watched until he was satisfied, then gestured for Rose to step into the hall. As I said, he reminded her quietly, she speaks irrationally. You will ignore anything she says that does not concern her comfort. Is that clear? Yes, sir. He went downstairs. Rose slipped back into the small room and sat in the darkness, listening to Catherine's drugged sleep and the old house. Creaking around them, a dead sister no one had mentioned, a warning delivered in terror, a husband who needed that warning silenced. Something terrible had happened in this house. Catherine believed it would happen again, and rose alone in a narrow bed between the master and his wife. With a hidden journal beneath a cabin floorboard and a face that apparently resembled the dead, Woman's understood that whatever had happened before was no longer just a story. She was inside it now. The next morning, Rose began to search for answers dot by daylight. She moved through the Hartwell house as a quiet shadow, preparing trays for Catherine, changing linens, reading softly from devotional books while her mistress drifted in and out of laudanum-heavy sleep. But behind every polite gesture, Rose was observing, measuring, and remembering. The house revealed itself in layers. Downstairs, the rooms were a performance of respectability, imported furniture polished to a shine, oil paintings of peaceful landscapes, a piano in the parlor where Anne practiced her scales each afternoon. Everything there was meant to be seen got upstairs. In the family's private rooms, the performance thinned. In Catherine's bedroom, small details betrayed another life beneath the polished surface. A locked cabinet stood against one wall, its key nowhere in sight. On the mantel, in a silver frame, rested a daguerreotype carefully angled so that it faced the bed. The image showed two young women in identical dresses, their faces strikingly alike. One was clearly Catherine younger, and softer around the eyes. The other shared her features but had darker hair, a more serious mouth, and a gaze that seemed to look straight through the lens at whoever held the picture. Rose waited until the opportunity came. Days later, when Thomas rode to Augusta to meet his cotton factor, the house settled into its predictable rhythm. The children were at their lessons. The house slaves were busy in kitchen and yard. Catherine lay dozing under the influence of her medicine, her breathing slow and even. Rose moved to the mantel, lifted the silver frame, and carefully eased the daguerreotype from its casing. On the back, written in faded ink, she found the names: Catherine and Louisa Peyton, Charleston, 1839, Louisa. The name Catherine had whispered in confusion the night before. The sister who, according to everything Rose had heard on the plantation, did not exist. She replaced the picture and crossed to the locked cabinet. The lock was not complex. Years before, in another house and another life, an enslaved carpenter had taught Rose how to coax cheap locks open with a hairpin and patience. White owners assumed enslaved women were helpless with such things. They were wrong. Rose knelt, listened to the faint clicks inside the metal, and within moments the cabinet door gave with a soft sigh. Inside lay stacks of letters tied with ribbons. Gone dull with age? All were addressed to Catherine in a flowing feminine hand. Rose took one from the middle of the bundle and unfolded it with care. The voice that emerged from the page was warm and intimate. Dear sister. Letter by letter, Rose watched the story unfold. Louisa Peyton, writing from Charleston, described her courtship with one Mr. Thomas Hartwell of Burke County, Georgia. She wrote of his visits, his flattery, his promises. She confided her conflicting feelings, her unease about plantation life, her father's insistence that Hartwell was an excellent match, her own attempts to be dutiful despite an unspoken dread. Over months, the courtship ripened into an engagement. Louisa described choosing fabrics for her wedding dress, planning a move to the country, trying to convince herself that leaving her coastal city for river land would bring happiness. Then, the letters stopped. The last one was dated November 7th, 1841, barely 2 weeks before the planned wedding. In it, Louisa wrote about finishing final preparations and feeling nervous about married life. But there was no hint of disaster. After that, nothing. No wedding announcement. No letter of joy or sorrow. Just silence. Rose searched the cabinet again and found no explanation. No obituary. No record of a broken engagement. It was as if Louisa had walked off the edge of the page and vanished. She replaced the letters exactly as she had found them, turned the key back in the lock, and set the daguerreotype on the mantel facing the bed once more. Catherine was stirring, now making small sounds in her sleep. Rose dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it on her mistress's forehead. Catherine's eyelids fluttered. Her gaze caught the silver frame, then shifted to Rose's face. Lou. She breathed. No. Ma'am. It is Rose, she answered quietly. Catherine's expression twisted, grief breaking through the drug-induced fog. I should have stopped her, she whispered. I should have told her what I suspected. But Father said Thomas was a good man. That I was being dramatic, that I was reading too much into silly fears. He said I was lucky he still wanted to marry into our family after the accident. What happened to Louisa, Mrs. Hartwell? Rose asked, keeping her voice calm, giving. Nothing away. They said she drowned. Catherine murmured. An accident. Thomas took her out to see the land he had bought along the river. He said she insisted on walking close to the water. He said the ground was muddy, that she slipped and fell, that the current was too strong. Her eyes filled. They found her body miles downstream, tangled in roots. Everyone spoke of how tragic it was. How devoted Thomas was in his grief. Her voice hardened. 6 months later, he began calling on me instead. The words hung in the room like smoke. Rose felt a cold heaviness settle in her chest. You do not believe it was an accident, she said softly. I was 15, Catherine answered. 15, but not blind. When Thomas came back to the house that day, his clothes were wet. Yes, but torn as well. He had scratches up his arms and across his face. He said he'd gotten them diving into the river and fighting the current. Maybe he had. Or maybe he got them struggling with Louisa when she tried to pull away from him. I will never know, but... She paused, swallowing. 2 years later, I found Louisa's diary. She had hidden it behind a loose brick in the fireplace of our shared bedroom in Charleston. In it, she wrote about Thomas's jealousy, his possessiveness, his attempts to cut her off from friends. She wrote that she feared him, that she planned to end the engagement. The last entry said she would tell him during that very carriage ride along the river. And your father? Rose asked. I told him, Catherine said bitterly. He said I was overexcited, that I was twisting my sister's private worries into drama. He said Thomas had witnesses who had seen them near the river, that the bank was treacherous after rain, that accidents happen. And then her eyes went bleak. He burned the diary. After that, he encouraged Thomas to court me. We were deeply in debt. Thomas's land and money could save us. My father decided that was more important than what really happened by the river. The truth settled between them. Catherine had been traded to the same man who might have killed her sister, bundled into marriage as neatly as a bale of cotton. Her safety a price her father was willing to pay. Why tell me this now? Rose asked quietly. Catherine looked at her for a long time. Because you look like her, she whispered. So much like her. Your coloring, your features. When Thomas saw you at that sale, I saw it in his eyes. I knew what it meant. He is trying to recreate her. A version of Louisa who cannot refuse him. One who can never embarrass him, never break an engagement, never escape. A woman who is legally his property in every way. Rose wanted to tell herself this was madness, the invention of a mind worn thin by grief and laudanum, but too much of it fit. The price Thomas had paid for her, the isolation, the strange privileges, the rules around her cabin, the way his gaze sometimes slid over her face as if he were measuring her against a memory. She was not just a slave, not even simply a woman he desired. She was a ghost made flesh, a replacement for someone whose death might not have been an accident at all. Over the next few days, Rose continued to care for Catherine with gentle efficiency, but she also began to gather more pieces of the puzzle. The house slaves were an unexpected well of knowledge. Dina, who had worked at Hartwell Plantation since Thomas's father's time, remembered the visit of a pretty Charleston girl years ago, Louisa, though why she had come was never fully explained downstairs. Rose listened as Dina described a nervous young woman who kept glancing over her shoulder, and a young planter whose smiles never reached his eyes. Dina recalled the day Thomas returned from the river, soaked and shouting for help, and how the men later brought back a torn, drowned body. She remembered thinking that Louisa's dress looked ripped as if by desperate hands. Not just Water. Fisher, too, had seen more than his position strictly allowed. As a German immigrant, never fully part of George's planter circle, he's more freely than a local man might. When Rose caught him alone near the barn, she carefully steered the conversation. He admitted that when he'd been hired, Thomas had given him strict rules. Rose was never to be whipped, never to work in the fields, never to have any man near her cabin. It wasn't about kindness, Fisher said. It was about possession. There had even been another woman before Rose, housed alone in the same cabin, favored and isolated in the same way. One day, Thomas announced she'd been sold to an Alabama plantation. Yet Fisher, who handled many practical arrangements, had never seen a bill of sale, and the regular trader swore no such woman had passed through his hands. The pattern became horribly clear. Louisa in Charleston, an unnamed woman in Georgia. Now, Rose down each step, Rose took toward the truth, tightened the noose around her life. She recorded everything in her journal at night, conversations, dates, details, knowing that if Thomas ever found the book, it would mean her death. But she also understood something else now. Knowledge was the only weapon she had. She could not testify in court. She could not accuse a white man and hope to be believed, but she could write. She could preserve what others wanted to erase. Catherine's health slowly improved. The more she talked, the less haunted her eyes looked. Sharing the story she had carried alone for a decade seemed to lift weight from her chest, even as it added to Rose's. I tried to be a good wife, Catherine said one afternoon as Rose brushed her hair, long pale strands falling like silk. Through Rose's fingers, I thought if I was perfect enough, if I ran the house well, if I bore him children, he would leave the past behind. But I see now he never wanted me. He wanted Louisa. And when she defied him, he decided to find someone he could own completely instead. She gave a short, bitter laugh. People say you are a slave and I am a free woman. I no longer believe there is such a clean line between us. I cannot own property, cannot keep my own money, cannot leave this house without his permission. If I ran, the law would drag me back. I am his in the eyes of the law, same as you. Rose knew this was no comfort, yet the shared recognition hung between them like a fragile bridge. Have you ever thought of leaving? Rose asked, where would I go? Catherine replied. My father would send me back. Society would treat me as mad or wicked. Thomas would raise the children to believe I had abandoned them. No, my cage is lined with lace and gilt, but it is a cage all the same. As she spoke, they heard a knock at the door. Richard, 14 now, stood in the frame, lanky and serious, already carrying his father's sharp-boned face. He looked at Rose with a discomfort he could not name, as if some part of him knew the system he'd been raised to inherit was wrong, even as he benefited from it. Mother, he said stiffly. Father wishes to see Rose in his study. Rose descended the stairs with a calmness she did not feel. Thomas sat behind his desk, pretending to study a ledger. He did not look at her right away. When he finally raised his head, his expression was smooth, but his eyes were harder than she had ever seen them. Dr. Winthrop credits you with Catherine's improvement, he said. He says you have been attentive and soothing. That pleases me. Thank you, sir. He also says the medicines have loosened her tongue, that she talks freely, that she shares stories. His gaze sharpened. I wonder what she has been saying. I wonder what you have heard. Rose met his eyes just long enough to show polite attention, and then dropped her gaze again. She speaks of many things, sir. Childhood, Charleston, worries about her children. The doctor said that is to be expected. Thomas rose and walked to the window, putting his back to her. You are an intelligent woman, Rose. You were educated in Philadelphia, were you not? A Quaker household. Most irregular. Her pulse stumbled. She had never told him that. The past she thought buried had been quietly unearthed. People like that fill servants' heads with dangerous ideas. equality, freedom, rights, nonsense that has no place here. I paid a high price for you because of your refinement. His voice grew cold. But if I believed you were carrying northern poison into my household, stirring up my wife's imagination, recording my affairs, he turned. That would make you a danger to everything I own. The threat was clear, dressed up in civilized words. Catherine's sister died by accident, he said flatly. That is the only story anyone needs to hear. If my wife says otherwise, that is her illness speaking. If you repeat such talk, I will know you for an ingrate and a traitor. And I deal harshly with traitors. Yes, sir, Rose said, because there was nothing else she could safely say. When she left his study, she understood two things with terrible clarity. First, he knew she had been asking questions. Second, he was afraid not enough to confess, but enough to threaten. An innocent man would have laughed at the idea of conspiracy. Thomas Hartwell had gone digging into her past instead. That night, as the house settled around her, Rose lay awake listening to the groan of beams and the faint tick of the clock downstairs. Sometime after midnight, she heard footsteps in the hall. They paused outside Catherine's door, then moved on. Rose slipped from her bed and crept to the window. Outside, a lantern bobbed through the dark, making its way toward the slave cabins. Even in the shifting glow, she knew the shape of the man carrying it. Thomas was heading toward her empty cabin. Fear cut through her like ice. If he searched her things and found the journal, everything would end tonight. There would be no law, no mercy, no time. She stole down the back stairs and slipped into the humid night. The smell of magnolia and river mud thick in the air. The cicada's shrill song covered her footsteps. She reached the clearing just as Thomas lifted the latch to her cabin, the lantern's light spilling over the threshold. She had seconds to act. Mr. Hartwell? She called, letting her voice come from behind him as if she had just arrived from another cabin. Is something wrong, sir? He spun, anger flaring across his face before he smoothed it away. Rose, what are you doing out here? I woke and remembered I'd left my needlework in the cabin. She lied smoothly. Mrs. Hartwell will ask for it in the morning. I did not wish to disturb you at such an hour. He stared at her, searching for a crack in the story. I came to ensure your cabin was secure, he said at last. There have been reports of prowlers. I wish to check the door. It was a ridiculous excuse. Slave cabins did not have locks. Planters did not patrol them in the middle of the night. But they both pretended to accept it because the alternative was to admit that he had come searching her private space, hunting for written evidence of his guilt. That is very thoughtful, sir, Rose murmured. As you can see, everything is in order. He stepped back from the doorway. Return to the main house. From now on, if you need anything from your cabin, you will ask permission in daylight. It is not safe for a woman to walk alone at night. Yes, sir. She walked away, spine straight, feeling his gaze on her until she turned the corner. Only then did she let herself shake. He was searching. He had not found the journal tonight. But she could not count on luck twice. When she crept back into the main house, Catherine was awake, clutching the edge of her coverlet with white-knuckled hands. I heard him, she whispered. Was it Thomas? Yes, he went to my cabin. Catherine's face went chalk-white. He knows. Rose, you must stop. He will kill you. I have seen how he behaves when cornered. That is how Louisa died after she told him she would not marry him. Within a day she was dead. Rose sat on the edge of the bed, breaking the invisible line between mistress and slave. Then you must help me, she said. Tell me everything you remember about that day. Every detail. If something happens to me, you must be able to tell the story. Not rumors, not fragments. The whole truth. Catherine stared at her for a long time, then nodded. In the dim light, with the house around them breathing and creaking like some great animal, she began to speak. As Rose listened, she understood that she could not wait for Thomas to make his move. The game had already started. The only way she might survive it was to force his hand, and to make sure that this time his secrets would not go back into. the dark with the woman he had chosen dot in the days that followed Catherine's fashion. Rose lived between two worlds, one where she performed the duties of a quiet, obedient caretaker, and another where every breath she drew added to the weight of dangerous knowledge pressing against her ribs. She rose early, braided her hair, prepared breakfast trays, aired linens, and read softly from religious texts. Yet underneath the practiced calm, she listened for the sound of Thomas's footsteps, for the creak of floorboards at night, for the whisper of danger she now expected at every turn. Catherine's recovery had slowed, but her voice had strengthened. Each day she confided more, as if years of silence were bleeding out through the cracks in her composure. Rose noticed that speaking truth after hiding it for a decade seemed to steady rather than unhinge her. Sometimes Rose wondered whether Catherine had been driven mad by doubt, not by grief. And that certainty was the medicine she had been denied. But truth was a knife with two edges. Every detail Catherine revealed carved a deeper outline of the man Rose now lived in fear of. While Catherine slept, Rose continued her careful investigation. She learned long ago that answers often came from those forced to watch quietly from the sidelines. Enslaved people had always been witnesses to the private lives of white families, storing knowledge no one suspected they possessed. Dina, the older woman who ran the kitchen with iron, efficiency gave Rose the most vivid memories. She had served on the plantation since Thomas's father ran it. She remembered the day Louisa Peyton visited, before any engagement was announced. While kneading dough one humid afternoon, Dina described Louisa's expression. Pretty as a picture, she said, hands moving with practiced rhythm, but nervous, always glancing at the door, like she wanted to leave a room before she ever stepped into it. Master Thomas was all charm, smiling at her like she hung the moon. But there's a kind of smile that hides teeth. I seen it before. Between them, Rose asked quietly, was there tension? Oh, yes, Dina murmured. I was serving in the parlor once. Miss Louisa told him she wanted to wait until spring for the wedding. Her voice was soft, but Master Thomas went still like a hunting dog that spotted something moving in the bushes. I knew then she'd crossed some line inside him. Then there was the overseer, Klaus Fischer. He had no illusions about plantation life and lacked the southern instinct to protect white reputations. Rose approached him cautiously one morning. As he supervised repairs on the barn roof, Mr. Fisher, she said, did the master ever keep another woman in that cabin before me? He hesitated. His face told her he had expected this question long before she asked it. There was another, he admitted in a low voice. A year before you came. I was told she'd been sold to Alabama, but I never saw papers. And the trader denied it, his jaw tightened. Some things you learn not to ask about. Rose knew the danger of pushing too far. A careless inquiry could get Dina whipped, Fisher dismissed, or herself dead. Still, she gathered each fragment like a stone for the foundation of something larger, something she would need when the moment came. Each night, Rose wrote. She waited until the house fell silent, then lifted the loose board beneath her cabins, bed and slipped her journal into her lap. The pages grew thicker with ink testimonies, suspicions, dates, details. She was writing her survival guide, but after Thomas's visit to her cabin, she knew she could not keep the journal there anymore. Every moment it remained hidden on his property was a blade hanging over her head. She had to move quickly, quietly, deliberately. Catherine noticed Rose's tension long before anyone else. One afternoon, as Rose brushed her mistress's hair, with slow, steady strokes, Catherine watched her in the mirror. You never look down when you're afraid, Catherine said softly. You look at everything, as if you're reading the air. Rose paused. Do I? Yes. The first time I saw you, I thought, here is a woman who sees more than she lets on. That frightened me at first. Now I think it may be what saves you. Rose resumed brushing. I only mean to understand the world I live in. And to survive it, Catherine whispered. Their eyes met in the mirror. Mrs. Hartwell. Rose said gently, what would you do if you truly believed your husband killed? Your sister? Catherine's face tightened. She closed her eyes and inhaled through trembling lips. I would do what I should have done years ago. Tell someone. Her eyes opened again, filled with fragile determination. Tell you. The admission hung between them like a vow dot, but Thomas noticed changes to Dot. He watched Rose with growing suspicion. His eyes followed her through rooms. His voice, always controlled, gained a sharpness that pierced through polite phrasing. One evening, as Rose carried a tray of broth to Catherine, Thomas caught her in the hallway. My wife speaks too much, he said quietly. Rose lowered her gaze. I worry, he continued, that her stories are contagious, that someone in her condition might inspire dangerous fantasies. You must understand, Rose, that I cannot have anyone encouraging her delusions. Yes, sir, she murmured. I hope so, he said, because if I believed you were repeating her inventions or worse, embellishing them, his eyes hardened, there would be consequences. She felt the threat like a cold hand closing around her throat. That night, she heard footsteps again. The same slow, deliberate tread in the hallway. They paused outside Catherine's door, then moved toward her small room. Rose lay perfectly still, eyes closed, breath shallow. The shadow beneath her door lingered, then retreated. Minutes later, she saw the lantern glow outside her window. Thomas was heading to her cabin once more. She only survived because she moved faster than fear. When she returned from the confrontation outside her cabin, still shaking, Catherine was awake. Rose sat beside her and told her what had happened. Catherine's fear turned to resolve. You cannot stay here, she whispered. You cannot wait for him to decide your fate. What choice do I have? Rose asked. A choice Louisa never had, Catherine replied. You know the truth. You know what he is? The truth was this. Rose was no longer hiding from danger. She was standing in the center of it, and so she made a decision that would change everything, not just for herself, but for the Hartwell family, for the plantation, and for the record that would survive more than a century later. She would not wait to be destroyed. She would strike first. For 3 days after the midnight encounter at her cabin, Rose moved like a woman threading a needle through storm winds slowly, carefully pretending calm while the world around her shuddered with danger. She took Catherine's temperature, refreshed her linens, and read prayers from the family Bible with soft steadiness. Even as her heartbeat drummed warnings beneath her composure, Thomas, meanwhile, became a man divided. He acted as though nothing unusual had happened, yet his eyes betrayed him. They flicked toward Rose too quickly. They lingered too long. He was watching her for signs of rebellion or fear or guilt, signs he himself had planted in the soil of the house. Rose understood then that survival required more than observation. She had to act. To stay still was to drown in the same river that had taken Louisa, or been used to make Louisa disappear. The question was not whether she would fight back. It was how the first step was to restore Thomas's sense of control. Rose. New men like him required the illusion of power the way they required air. If she moved too openly, he would crush her at the first opportunity. If she moved too quietly, he might attack out of paranoia alone. What she needed was a mask, familiar, harmless, obedient. So she gave him one. She read scripture loudly enough for the servants to hear. The verses chosen deliberately: humility, patience, obedience. She arranged Catherine's pillows with gentle hands whenever Thomas entered the room. She let him see her darning a hem or polishing silver, as though her world had narrowed to the smallest, safest tasks. On Thursday afternoon, she even orchestrated a moment where Thomas, accidentally, saw her reading the Bible to Catherine, her voice low, her posture demure. The performance worked. He paused in the doorway, watched for a long moment, then nodded in faint approval. For the first time in days, Rose saw the tension ease from his shoulders. Good. She needed him calm, because that same evening, she planned to strike. She chose Thursday for a simple reason. Every Thursday night, Thomas held a meeting with his cotton factor and 2 neighboring planters. They drank whiskey, argued about crop forecasts, and filled the study with cigar smoke and laughter. The meetings lasted exactly 2 hours, long enough for Rose to work without interruption. and loud enough to hide small movements around the house. She had timed them carefully for weeks as dusk gathered around the plantation. Rose went to Catherine's room with the laudanum tonic. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cup. Is it tonight? She whispered double quotes, yes. Rose replied. You must sleep deeply. Whatever happens, you must not wake. Catherine swallowed the dose. Her eyelids fluttered. Before sleep claimed her, she caught Rose's wrist. Do not underestimate him, she murmured. He believes he can shape the world to his will. Rose placed Catherine's hand gently on the coverlet. So do I, she said softly downstairs. The house vibrated with the deep laughter of men who believed the land and everyone on it belonged to them. Rose entered the kitchen, where Dina was wiping down the long wooden table. Mr. Hartwell asked for fresh coffee. Rose announced loud enough for the others to hear. For the gentleman in the study, this, too, was part of the plan. Witnesses would later confirm Rose had gone to the study on Thomas's own request. She prepared the tray, coffee pot, cups, small bowl of sugar, and from beneath her apron, she took the journal wrapped tightly in oilcloth to protect it from damp and tied the string. With steady hands, her entire life rested inside that bundle. Her memories, her investigations, her accusations, her one. Weapon. She carried the tray to the study door and knocked. Enter, Thomas called. She slipped inside. 4 men sat around the desk amid cigar haze and open ledgers. None looked at her for longer than a heartbeat. A slave woman pouring coffee was as noteworthy as a breeze through the curtains. Perfect. She needed to be invisible when she asked. Permission to leave. Thomas waved her away without looking up. She walked out of the study, turned the corner, and did not go upstairs. Instead, she slipped out the back door into the humid night. The moon was hidden behind drifting clouds, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia and river mud. Darkness wrapped itself around her, like a borrowed cloak. Moving quickly. She went to her cabin and retrieved the oilcloth bundle from its hiding place. Then she crossed the western field and reached the slope that led to the Savannah River. The river roared softly in the night, swollen with spring rains. Here on this bank, Louisa had supposedly slipped and fallen. Here on this bank, Thomas had returned alone. Tonight, it would hold a different story. Rose knelt and arranged the scene with careful, deliberate precision. She tore her shawl and snagged pieces on low branches. She scuffed the mud to suggest a struggle or a slip. She placed the journal beneath a cluster of brush visible enough to be found by searchers. Hidden enough to appear naturally abandoned. She imagined how it would look at dawn. A torn shawl, a disturbed bank, a missing woman, and a book full of damning truths. Either Thomas would be forced to face investigation, or his lies would finally choke him. She had taken back control in the only way she could. Returning to the main house, she found Dina still awake in the kitchen. The older woman looked up sharply. Child, what have you done? Nothing yet, Rose said. Tomorrow morning, if I'm not at breakfast, tell Mr. Fisher that you saw me walking toward the river at dusk. Tell him I did not answer when you called. Dina's breath caught. That's a dangerous game. It's the only one I have a chance to win. Dina studied her face, saw the resolve there and sighed. I'll do it. God help us all. Hours later, Rose lay in her narrow bed in the small upstairs room, listening to the house fall silent. The men ended their meeting. Thomas checked on Catherine. He paused, as always, outside Rose's door. She kept her eyes closed, breathing steadily until his footsteps moved away. Only then did she allow herself to think. Tomorrow decides everything. If they found the journal before Thomas could destroy it, she might live. If Thomas found it first, she was dead. There was no middle ground anymore. And as dawn began to soften the edges of the sky, Rose knew the moment of reckoning was nearly upon her. Rose woke to shouting. For one disorienting moment, she thought she was still dreaming, the echoes of her plan weaving through her sleep. But then she heard the hurried footsteps on the porch, the pounding on the front door, the sharp calls of men outside, and she knew the storm she had summoned had broken. Catherine stood in Rose's doorway, her hair unpinned and her shawl thrown hastily over her nightdress. Her face was white with fear. What is happening? She whispered. I don't know, Rose said, though her heart already understood. Stay here, ma'am. She moved down the stairs with controlled urgency. In the hallway, Thomas Hartwell was pulling on his coat, his face a mask of focused alarm. Klaus Fischer burst through the door a moment later, breathless. Mr. Hartwell, Fischer gasped. Dinah says she saw Rose walking toward the river last evening, acting strange. We need to search the riverbank at once. I fear she may have. He stopped himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Drowned. Run away. Met with foul play. Thomas's eyes sharpened. I see. He turned sharply. Gather the men. Search the riverbank immediately. Rose stepped from the shadows, choosing her moment. I am here, sir. Every head turned. Fisher exhaled in visible relief. Thomas, however, stilled, not with comfort, but with something closer to disappointment. Rose, he said slowly. Dinah claimed she saw you near the river at dusk. I went for a walk after delivering coffee to your study, she replied, her voice steady. The air was cool and Mrs. Hartwell was sleeping. If that was improper, I apologize. Fisher shook his head in confusion. Dinah said you did? Not respond when she called. I was deep in prayer, Rose said quietly. Perhaps I did not hear her. Thomas's gaze bored into her. He was searching for cracks, for fear, for guilt. Rose gave him nothing but humility. Satisfied or not, he turned to Fisher. Since the alarm was raised, we should still check the riverbank, ensure no one else is missing. Rose's pulse hammered. This was the crucial moment. Once they found the stage scene, her torn shawl, the disturbed mud, the hidden journal, the world would begin to tilt. She stood completely still while Fisher gathered a group of enslaved men and hurried toward the river. Thomas remained in the hallway, his face composed but rigid beneath the surface. Catherine came halfway down the stairs, her eyes flicking anxiously between the two. Minutes passed, then footsteps running. Fisher reappeared, carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. Mr. Hartwell, he said, his voice strained. We found this by the riverbank. Rose felt her breath catch. Thomas's face drained of color. What is it? He demanded. Fisher hesitated. There were signs someone had been there. Mud disturbed. Cloth caught on branches. And this, he lifted the bundle. A journal. Hidden, but not well. I read a few lines. Sir, it mentions a woman named Louisa. Catherine gasped softly on the staircase. Thomas lunged forward and snatched the bundle from Fisher's hands with a force that shattered his calm facade. That is private property, Thomas snapped. You had no right, sir, Fisher interrupted, voice steady, though his hands trembled. The journal describes events, accusations. If there is any truth in it, the sheriff must be notified. Thomas's rage erupted. You forget your place. You forget to whom you are speaking. Fisher stood his ground. I am speaking as a man who has a conscience. The words stunned the room. Even Rose felt time pause. Thomas's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. This journal is nothing but the lies of an ungrateful slave. And if she has written fantasies to destroy my reputation, I will see her whipped, sold, or Catherine stepped forward. It is not lies. She said softly. Everything stopped. Thomas turned toward her, slow and lethal. Catherine lifted her chin, pale but resolute. The journal contains my words, she continued. My memories. My suspicions about my sister, Louisa's death. I have remained silent for 10 years. I will not remain silent now. Thomas took one step toward her, and that single movement radiated danger. Catherine, he said, his voice trembling with fury. You are unwell. This is madness. No, she replied. What is madness is pretending I imagined everything. What is madness is believing no one will ever question you. Rose met Fisher's eyes from across the hallway. In them, she saw something flicker. Conviction. Double quotes, Mr. Hartwell. Fisher said, turning toward the door, I am taking this journal. To the sheriff? No, Thomas barked. You will give it to me. But he had already lost. His overseer stepped back. If the journal is worthless, as you claim, then you have nothing to fear from an investigation. Thomas's hand twitched toward the pistol in his coat. Rose froze. Catherine inhaled sharply. Fisher steadied himself. Don't, Fisher. Warned, voice low. The men outside heard everything. If you shoot me now, you confirm the journal. Thomas's face contorted, not in fear, but in something worse. Understanding, he was trapped, humiliated, cornered by a woman he had tried to remake and another he had tried to break. Finally, with a choked sound that was neither word nor breath, Thomas stepped back. Get out, he hissed. All of you. He pointed at Fisher. You are fired. He pointed at Rose. You are sold. I'll have the traitor here by noon. He pointed at Catherine. And you return to your father. This marriage is over. Then he turned and slammed his study door so hard the windows rattled for a long, heavy moment. No one moved. Catherine sagged against the banister. Tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Fisher held the journal as though it were a living thing. Rose inhaled, slowly her first full breath in days. What happens now? Catherine whispered. Fisher swallowed. I take this to the sheriff. Whatever he chooses to do, at least the truth is recorded. And Mr. Hartwell cannot bury it. Rose nodded. Her plan was no longer a secret weapon. It was a spark, and the fire had begun. Thomas Hartwell did not come out of his study for the rest of the day. His footsteps, once dominant and rhythmic throughout the house, ceased entirely. The thick mahogany door remained shut, and the plantation accustomed to the constant pressure of his oversight fell into a strange, expectant hush. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for a man who had lost control of everything he believed immovable. Inside that silence, life on the plantation began shifting in ways that were small yet unmistakable. Fisher left the main house carrying the journal, his jaw tight, his eyes forward. He did not ask Rose or Catherine to accompany him. He understood the danger of involving them further. But before stepping off the veranda, he looked at Rose with a solemn certainty. I will not let this disappear, he said simply. Whatever happens next, the truth will be known. And then he walked down the long drive toward town. Rose watched until he vanished among the trees. Only after he was gone did she feel the trembling in her knees. The sheriff arrived that afternoon. Sheriff Daniels, a large man with a sun-reddened face and the easy confidence of someone who had long ago decided where his loyalties lay, sat in the parlor with Fisher for nearly an hour. They spoke quietly, voices rising only once or twice, as though Fisher was pressing points the sheriff preferred not to hear. Rose wasn't called to speak. Neither was Catherine. She listened from the upstairs hallway, straining to distinguish words through the muffled air. But all she could glean were tones: doubt, insistence, frustration, and finally, resignation. When the sheriff left, his expression was troubled, not sympathetic, not convinced. But troubled. It was more than Rose had expected. Over the next days, the consequences unfolded like cracks spreading through old plaster. Thomas sent for his lawyer, a severe-looking man who arrived with a leather case full of papers and a grim expression. Business associates visited, one after another, emerging from the study with the tight-lipped look of men who didn't like what they now knew. A few offered curt nods to Catherine. None spoke to Rose. Word spread through Burr County faster than Thomas could control. A respected planter accused of murdering his first fiancée. An enslaved woman documenting his secrets in a journal. His own wife supporting the accusations. It didn't matter that the sheriff declined to file charges. Public opinion was the South's true law, and rumor was its swiftest judge. Creditors withdrew or demanded immediate settlement. Neighbors who had shared whiskey and hunting trips avoided Thomas's gaze at church. The agricultural board quietly asked him to step down. By the end of the week, Thomas Hartwell was a man no longer welcome in his own world. Inside the house, Catherine changed too. Her strength returned as though her voice had carried medicine no doctor could prescribe. She walked without swaying, spoke without hesitation, and began making arrangements to leave once the legal formalities allowed. One afternoon, she sat at her vanity brushing her pale hair, each stroke slow and controlled. Rose stood behind her, folding garments into a travel trunk. I used to think I had no choices, Catherine said softly. But I see now, I simply did not take them. Rose paused. What choices do you have now? Catherine met her eyes in the mirror. I can leave. I can speak the truth. And I can refuse to let the rest of my life be defined by a man who nearly destroyed 2 women before me. 2 women, Louisa and Rose. They understood each other then, not as mistress and slave, but as survivors of the same man's violence. Thomas, meanwhile, was unraveling. He stopped shaving, stopped eating much. He no longer walked the grounds. The plantation that once bent itself around his will seemed to shrink away from him. Servants moved quietly, avoiding the study. The children whispered when they saw him, unsettled by this diminished, brooding version of their father. Rose caught only glimpses of him now and then, pacing behind closed curtains, sitting motionless at his desk, staring at nothing. The man who had once seemed impossibly powerful now looked like someone trying to hold together a house built on sand. He was afraid, and fear, she knew, made dangerous men desperate. On the 10th day after the journal's discovery, everything changed. A meeting was held in the study. Thomas, his lawyer, 2 local businessmen, and an investor from Savannah. The conversation rose and fell sharply, punctuated by splintering anger and low, panicked pleas. The children hid upstairs. Even the house slaves paused their work, listening. When the door finally opened, the men filed out grim-faced, leaving Thomas alone. That evening he announced his decision. He was selling the plantation, not part of it. Not leasing fields. The entire estate land, house, equipment, livestock, everything he would leave. Georgia for Texas within the week got it was a practical move. Texas was full of men looking to run from past mistakes. And land there was cheap, plentiful, and distant from scandal. But to those who knew him, the truth was clear. Thomas wasn't leaving to rebuild. He was fleeing. Rose expected him to send for her that night, to confront her, threaten her, or attempt something worse before she left his grasp. Instead, he did nothing. He didn't speak to her, didn't look at her, didn't come near her. It was as if she had become the ghost he once tried to resurrect. Dangerous, untouchable. A reminder of his crimes, but silence could be as ominous as rage. Rose slept poorly, always listening for footsteps that never came. 3 days before his departure, Thomas finally acted, but not as she expected. He summoned Fisher and handed him a document. A legal bill of sale transferring Rose to a slave trader bound for New Orleans. He didn't deliver the message himself. He didn't face her. He simply issued orders from behind his closed door, as though ashamed to look at the woman who had exposed him. But fate had shifted. The sale never happened. The trader, upon hearing Rose was a writer of journals, refused the purchase. A slave who wrote, especially one who wrote dangerous things, was a liability no trader wanted. And in the strange space left by Thomas's unraveling, something new emerged. Fisher Stern, and painfully principled approached Rose with an offer she had never dreamed could be real. I used my savings, he said hesitantly, and Mrs. Hartwell's father contributed the rest. The papers have been filed with the county. He handed her an envelope. Her hand shook as she opened it. Manumission papers. Her freedom? She stood there staring, breath caught, the world narrowing to a thin, bright line on a crisp page. I cannot undo what was done to you, Fisher said quietly. But you saved lives here, including mine. You deserve the chance to choose your own path. Rose looked from the papers to the man who had risked his livelihood for her, and then to Catherine standing behind him with tears in her eyes. For the first time since arriving at Hartwell Plantation, Rose felt her future rather than close in. A door was opening, slowly, precariously but undeniably, and she intended to walk through it in the final week before Thomas Hartwell's departure. The plantation felt like a body preparing to shed a diseased limb. Workers moved quietly, their steps quick and efficient, as though afraid the ground itself might crack beneath them if they stayed still too long. Wagons creaked through the yard, carrying trunks, ledgers, crates packed by trembling hands. Even the animals sensed something shifting. The horses tossed their heads nervously, and the dogs barked without reason. Rose did not go to the main house unless required. She felt the air tightening around her, tension coiling like a snake ready to strike. Thomas remained locked in his study, emerging only to speak in clipped tones to his lawyer or bark orders at servants who didn't dare meet his eyes. His once polished appearance deteriorated. Stubble shadowed his jaw. His waistcoat hung wrinkled. His boots muddied from pacing the yard at night. He was a man hollowed out, not by guilt, but by exposure. Rumor had dissolved his standing. He had no protection left but escape. Catherine, meanwhile, packed her belongings under Rose's quiet assistance. Trunks lined the hallway, filled with dresses, heirlooms, and the children's belongings. For the first time in a decade, Catherine seemed to breathe without fear constricting her chest. "Do you know what freedom feels like?" she asked one afternoon while folding Anne's dresses. Rose paused. "Not yet," she said. "But I think I will soon." Catherine smiled faintly. Then we are both stepping into something new. There was no pretense left between them, no hierarchy. Only shared survival. Catherine also insisted. "Rose, keep a small velvet pouch containing a silver comb and 2 gold coins. You will need resources," she said. "Independence is not simply a feeling. It is something you must guard." Rose tried to refuse, but Catherine pressed the pouch firmly into her palm. "I owe you more than this," she said. "But for now, take it." On the morning Thomas was set to leave, the plantation gathered, some out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity. Thomas stepped onto the veranda, looking thinner, older, as if the weight of his past had finally crushed the facade. He'd worn for so long. His eyes swept the group until they found Rose. She stood at the back, her posture straight, her gaze unbroken. In that moment, he seemed to realize that she had become someone beyond his reach, not his possession, not his mirror of Louisa, not his victim. A flicker of something crossed his face, anger, perhaps, but also fear. He descended the stairs without addressing anyone. The finality of his retreat echoed across the yard. Moments later, the carriage door slammed, and the horses lurched forward as the wheels rolled away, kicking dust into the morning sun. A strange stillness settled over the plantation. Thomas Hartwell was gone. But the shadow he cast would linger. Catherine and her children left 2 days later for Charleston. Before stepping into the carriage, she embraced Rose, a gesture neither woman could have imagined weeks before. "If you ever need me," Catherine whispered, "send word. I will not fail you again." Rose nodded, though she knew their paths were parting for vastly different worlds. Catherine climbed into the carriage, pulled her children close, and the horses carried them away from the place where dreams had died and truths had finally surfaced. Rose watched until the road swallowed the carriage, then faced the plantation one last time, the slave cabins, the magnolia trees, the river that had nearly written her fate. She closed her eyes, felt the weight of her manumission papers in her pocket, and exhaled a breath that seemed to carry years of fear out of her body. She walked away with a single bag, a journal of truth, and a future she would define herself. The Hartwell Plantation stood behind her, no longer a place of terror, but a ruin of someone else's power, a chapter closed, another waiting to be written. Rose traveled north by coach, steamboat, and foot. Each mile between her and Georgia felt like a thread snapping loose from the net that had once held her captive. In Philadelphia, where the Quaker family who once sheltered her still lived, she found safety, work, and a name that was hers alone. She wrote, she taught, she lived. Years passed, and the country tore itself apart in war. Slavery crumbled under the weight of conflict and conviction. Emancipation, long whispered about, became reality, messy, imperfect, but real. through those turbulent decades, Rose kept the journal that saved her life tucked beneath her mattress, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had once lain by the riverbank. She added pages to it, accounts of enslaved women she remembered, the injustices she had witnessed, the quiet resistances she had admired. She wrote of Catherine, who divorced the memory of her husband and remade her life in Charleston. She wrote, of Fisher, who found work at another estate and carried the weight of his choices with quiet dignity. And she wrote of Louisa, whose story had started everything, though she never lived to see its conclusion. In 1889, Rose passed away in her Philadelphia home, surrounded by neighbors who knew her as a teacher, a writer, a woman of exceptional poise. They did not know the full scope of what she had survived, only that she had been shaped by something vast and unforgiving. Among her belongings, neatly labeled and preserved, lay the journal that found its way into Catherine's extended family. Through a final letter, Rose had written one that requested, simply, tell the truth. Let no part of it be lost again. Decades later, when the Savannah River Valley records were unsealed in 1983, the Hartwell cabin captured archivists' attention because it contradicted everything they believed about Southern slavery. But when they discovered Rose's journal among Catherine's donated family papers, when they read her words, her testimony, her careful reconstruction of a man who tried to bend life and death to his will, they realized they were not holding a diary. They were holding evidence, proof of a hidden crime, proof of a woman's intellect and bravery, proof that even in bondage, truth could survive. The cabin that once imprisoned her became a monument to resistance. The journal that saved her life became a historical record, and the woman known only as the Mulatto Rose in plantation ledgers became something far greater. A witness, a survivor, a voice that refused to be silenced.